To understand the miracle that occurred in the English Channel in 1942, you first have to understand the nightmare that preceded it. For 2 years, the narrow strip of water separating England from occupied France was not a defensive moat. It was a graveyard. By the winter of 1941, the German Kriegsmarine had turned the Channel into a killing zone where British sailors died with terrifying regularity. The wreckage of 400,000 tons of Allied shipping littered the seabed. 12 Royal Navy destroyers lay broken on the bottom. Over 2,000 sailors and merchant seamen had been burned, drowned, or blown apart in the freezing dark. The architects of this slaughter were not the famous U-boats prowling the Atlantic, nor the massive battleships like the Bismarck. The danger came from something smaller, faster, and infinitely more vicious. The British called them E-boats, short for enemy war motorboats. The Germans called them Schnellboot, literally fast boats. And in 1940, they were the most dangerous small combat vessels on Earth. Built by the legendary Lürssen shipyard in Bremen, the Schnellboot was an engineering masterpiece that made British coastal vessels look like toys. They were nearly 115 feet long, powered by 3 massive Daimler-Benz diesel engines that generated 4,000 horsepower. They could hit 48 miles per hour in calm water. But their true genius lay in their hull design. German engineers had perfected the round bilge hull, a shape that allowed the boat to slice through rough seas without slamming. While British boats were forced to slow down to a crawl in the choppy waters of the Channel to avoid breaking their backs, the German hunters could maintain attack speeds even in a force 4 gale. They were heavily armed predators. Each Schnellboot carried 2 21-inch torpedoes, the same devastating weapons used by heavy destroyers. A single hit delivered 600 pounds of hexanite explosive, enough to vaporize a merchant ship or break a warship in half. They operated from reinforced concrete bunkers in Cherbourg, Boulogne, and Rotterdam, sallying out at night to terrorize the coastal convoys that were Britain's lifeline. Against this high-tech menace, the British Royal Navy had almost nothing. The coastal forces of 1940 were a ragtag collection of motor torpedo boats, MTBs, that crews grimly referred to as floating coffins. They were built of plywood and mahogany. They were powered by gasoline engines that turned into infernos when hit. Their hulls were the hard chine design, flat-bottomed speedboats that pounded so violently in rough water that crews often suffered broken ankles and spinal injuries just from the ride. Tactically, the British were hopelessly outmatched. The standard Royal Navy doctrine was to close with the enemy and launch torpedoes. But to launch a torpedo, you had to get within 1,000 yards. The German boats, armed with 20mm automatic cannons, would simply wait for the British to approach and then shred them with gunfire long before they reached launch range. It was a massacre. Week after week, British crews went out into the dark, knowing they were slower, blind in the dark without radar, and bringing knives to a gunfight. By January 1942, the situation at the Admiralty in London was approaching panic. The statisticians had run the numbers. If the losses continued at the current rate, the coastal convoy system would collapse within 6 months. The coal that powered the factories, the food that fed London, the steel for the tanks, it all moved by sea. If the convoys stopped, Britain lost the war. The Admiralty was paralyzed by tradition. They kept building more torpedo boats, kept sending men to die using failed tactics, praying for a miracle. They didn't know that the solution to their problem wasn't in the halls of naval command. It was in the mind of a 35-year-old lawyer named Robert Hitchins. Robert Hitchins was an anomaly. Before the war, he had been a barrister, a man who fought with words in quiet courtrooms. He had no military lineage, no engineering degree, and no respect for naval tradition. But he had one qualification that the admirals lacked. He had looked a Schnellboot in the eye and survived. In August 1940, Hitchins was commanding a small torpedo boat off the Belgian coast when he was jumped by a German flotilla. He tried to follow the manual. He tried to maneuver for a torpedo shot. The result was catastrophic. German cannon fire tore his plywood boat to pieces. He watched his friends die around him, helpless to fight back with his light machine guns. He limped back to port in a sinking boat, washing the blood off the deck, and made a vow. He would never be outgunned again. Hitchins spent the next year obsessively analyzing the war in the Channel. He realized that the Royal Navy was asking the wrong question. They were asking, how do we sink them with torpedoes? Hitchins realized the answer was, you don't. Torpedoes were slow, unreliable, and required suicidal proximity. The Schnellboot was a soft target. It had no armor. You didn't need a heavy torpedo to sink it. You just needed to punch enough holes in it to let the ocean in. He proposed a heresy. He wanted to strip the torpedoes off the boats. In their place, he wanted guns. Heavy guns, automatic cannons, power-operated aircraft turrets capable of pumping out thousands of rounds a minute. He wanted to build a motor gunboat, MGB. The experts laughed at him. They told him it was physically impossible. The recoil of a 2-pounder anti-tank gun would tear the wooden deck apart. The weight of the ammunition would make the boat too slow to catch the Germans. The muzzle flash would blind the crew at night. And above all, the naval establishment believed that a small boat existed solely to carry torpedoes. A boat without torpedoes was, in their eyes, useless. But Hitchins found a co-conspirator in Hubert Scott Payne, the eccentric genius behind the British Powerboat Company. Scott Payne didn't care about naval tradition. He cared about speed and violence. When Hitchins explained the concept, Scott Payne didn't laugh. He went to the drawing board. Together, they created a monster. The Mark VI motor gunboat was 71 feet of aggressive engineering. Powered by 3 supercharged Packard engines producing 4,000 horsepower, it could hit 38 knots. But it was the teeth that mattered. They mounted a semi-automatic 2-pounder cannon on the bow, a weapon usually found on tanks. On the stern, they bolted a 6-pounder gun capable of smashing engine blocks. And amidships, they installed twin power-operated turrets taken from Defiant fighter planes, each housing 4 303 machine guns. It was a floating porcupine. While a standard torpedo boat could fire maybe 500 rounds a minute, Hitchins' MGB could unleash a storm of 4,000 rounds a minute. It was designed for one thing: close-quarters butchery. In February 1942, Hitchins took command of the 8th MGB flotilla at Dover. His orders were simple but revolutionary. Seek out the enemy and destroy him with gunfire. For the first time, British sailors weren't going out to survive. They were going out to hunt. The test came on the night of March 13, 1942. It was a cold, black night in the Channel, with a mist hanging over the water. Hitchins was leading a patrol in MGB 64. His radar operator picked up contacts to the northeast. It was the German 2nd Flotilla, led by the ace commander, Kapitänleutnant Rudolf Petersen. Petersen was a veteran. He had killed British boats before. When he saw the small silhouettes approaching, he assumed it was another pack of helpless torpedo boats trying to get lucky. He turned his heavy Schnellboots to engage, expecting the British to scatter. Instead, MGB 64 charged straight at him. At 500 yards, Hitchins gave the order, "Open fire!" The night was instantly ripped apart. The power turrets on the British boats spun and locked on. Streams of tracer fire, thick as a solid bar of light, hammered into the leading German boat. The 2-pounder cannon thumped a steady rhythm, sending high-explosive shells smashing into the German bridge. On the German side, panic set in. Petersen's boat, S-105, was hit by a wall of lead. The bridge was riddled. The gun crews on the foredeck were cut down before they could pull their triggers. Petersen himself was wounded by shrapnel. He had expected a few sporadic bursts of machine gun fire. Instead, he was facing a buzzsaw. The German formation collapsed. S-7 tried to come to Peterson's aid and was immediately mauled by the 6-pounder on Hitchins' stern. The German hulls, designed for speed but unarmored, were perforated. Diesel fuel spilled into the bilges. Fires broke out. For 10 minutes, the channel lit up with explosions. And then, something unprecedented happened. The Germans ran. The hunters turned their sterns and fled at maximum speed toward the safety of the French coast, trailing smoke. Hitchins brought his boats back to Dover at dawn. They had paint scratched and a few bullet holes, but no one was dead. They had engaged a superior German force and broken them. The doctrine of overwhelming firepower had been proven in blood. Hitchins expected a hero's welcome. He expected the Admiralty to immediately order mass production of his gunboats. He expected to win the war. 3 weeks later, he was summoned to the Admiralty building in London. He walked into a wood-paneled office to face Rear Admiral Lionel Preston, the director of the small vessels pool. Preston was a man of the old Navy, a veteran of Jutland, a believer in the battleship and the torpedo. He held Hitchins' action report in his hand like it was a piece of rotting fish. "Lieutenant Commander," Preston said, his voice cold, "I have reviewed your report. You expended 3,000 rounds of ammunition in 12 minutes. You risked His Majesty's vessels in a gunfight against superior tonnage. This is not naval warfare. It is a street brawl." Hitchins tried to argue. He pointed out the damage to the Germans. He pointed out that no British sailors had died. Preston cut him off. "One lucky skirmish does not validate a flawed concept. Your boats are heavy. They are logistically unsustainable. The ammunition consumption alone is bankrupting the supply chain. I am recommending that the motor gunboat program be suspended. We will focus our resources on torpedo boats. That is a proven weapon." The room went silent. Hitchins felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't just his career that was being killed. It was his men. If the MGBs were scrapped, the crews would go back to the floating coffins. They would go back to dying in the dark. The Schnellboots would continue their reign of terror, and the convoys would stop. Hitchins looked at the Admiral. He realized that logic wouldn't work. Facts wouldn't work. He was up against the most powerful force in the British military: inertia. He needed a miracle. He needed to go over Preston's head. But a lieutenant commander does not simply walk into the office of the Sea Lords. He left the Admiralty that day with a deadline. He had 1 month before the program was officially canceled. 1 month to prove that his gunboats weren't just lucky, that they were the future of naval warfare. He needed an ally, and he found one in the shadows of the naval establishment. Captain Augustus Agar, a Victoria Cross winner from the First World War, was too old to fight, but powerful enough to whisper in the right ears. Agar told Hitchins there was only one man who could save them: Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten was a maverick, a man who loved gadgets and hated rules. But to get Mountbatten's attention, Hitchins couldn't just write a report. He had to show him. He proposed a trial by combat, a rigged game where his MGBs would face off against the Navy's beloved torpedo boats in a series of live-fire exercises. It was a gamble. If his boats failed, if a gun jammed, if an engine stalled, it was over. The date was set for April 17, 1942. The location? The choppy waters off Weymouth. Hitchins had 3 weeks to prepare his crew for the performance of their lives. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't just fighting for a boat design. He was fighting for control of the English Channel. And the Germans, stinging from their defeat in March, were already planning their revenge. They were moving more boats to Cherbourg. They were changing their tactics. The next time they met, they wouldn't be surprised. As the gray dawn rose over Weymouth Bay on the morning of the trial, the wind was howling. The waves were 4 feet high, horrible conditions for small boats, perfect conditions for disaster. Hitchins stood on the bridge of MGB 64, gripping the rail, watching the staff cars of the admirals pull up to the pier. He looked at his gunners, shivering in their turrets. "Everything depends on today," he told them. "Don't miss." The waves off Weymouth were running 4 feet high, capped with white foam. On the deck of a standard motor torpedo boat, MTB, the ride was a bone-shattering ordeal. The hard chine hull, designed for flat-out speed on calm water, was slamming into every trough like a sledgehammer hitting concrete. The gunners, clinging to their twin Lewis guns, couldn't keep their feet, let alone track a target. When they fired, their tracers sprayed wildly into the gray sky, hopelessly inaccurate. From the bridge of the destroyer HMS Castleton, the assembled brass of the Admiralty watched through binoculars. They saw exactly what they expected. Small boats were useless in rough weather. Admiral Preston turned to his aides, ready to sign the order that would scrap Robert Hitchins' program. Then came the roar of Packard engines. MGB-64 accelerated into the chop. Unlike the slapping MTBs, Hitchins' boat didn't fight the ocean. It rode it. The modified hull sliced through the waves, keeping the deck stable. Hitchins ordered the weapons free. The sound was distinct, a terrifying, rhythmic, tearing noise that drowned out the wind. The power-operated turrets spun with mechanical precision. 4,000 rounds a minute erupted from the boat. The target, a canvas sleeve towed a mile away, wasn't just hit, it was disintegrated. The tracers formed a solid cone of fire that chewed the target to ribbons in seconds. Next came the 2-pounder cannon on the bow. Thump, thump, thump. The semi-automatic fire tore into a floating wooden target representing a Schnellboot hull. Splinters the size of fence posts flew into the air. Within a single pass, the target was sinking. Silence fell over the bridge of the Castleton. The skepticism evaporated. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, lowered his binoculars. He turned to the stunned officers around him and said, "I have never seen a small ship handle firepower like that. Give him the boats." The victory was total. The Admiralty didn't just approve the program, they doubled it. Hitchins was promoted to commander and given a mandate to revolutionize coastal forces. But building the boats was the easy part. The hard part was changing the minds of the men who sailed them. For 2 years, British crews had been trained to be victims. Their doctrine was hit and run, launch a torpedo and flee before the Germans killed you. Hitchins had to tear that fear out of them. He traveled from base to base, Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth, Dartmouth, drilling his new crews relentlessly. "We do not run," he told them. "We are the superior ship. We close to point-blank range. We burn them to the waterline." By the summer of 1942, the English Channel began to change. The hunters were becoming the hunted. In June, MGB flotillas intercepted a German convoy off the Dutch coast and shattered it. In July, they caught 3 Schnellboots laying mines and damaged 2 of them so badly they had to be towed home. The German radio traffic, intercepted by British intelligence, began to show a new emotion: caution. But in the heavily fortified bunkers of Cherbourg, the German commanders were not ready to surrender the night. Kapitän-Leutnant Rudolf Petersen, the leader of the Schnellboot force, was a cold, analytical tactician. He studied the after-action reports with the precision of a surgeon. He saw the pattern. The British gunboats were aggressive, perhaps too aggressive. They charged in a straight line, fixated on their targets, dumping their ammunition in the first 5 minutes of combat. Petersen saw a weakness. If he could bait the British into emptying their magazines on a decoy, they would be helpless. Then he would flank them with fresh boats and finish them with torpedoes. He planned his masterstroke for the night of August 12, 1942. The location? The dark waters off Portland Bill. He assembled 8 of his best boats, the elite of the 2nd and 4th flotillas. His plan was a classic kill box. 2 boats would act as bait to draw the British in. 4 boats would circle wide to the west. 2 more would cut off the retreat to the east. It was an ambush designed to wipe out Hitchins and his entire flotilla in a single stroke. On the evening of August 12th, Hitchins led his force out of Portland Harbor. He had 4 motor gunboats, including his flagship MGB-64, and 2 torpedo boats in support. The night was pitch black, with a fresh breeze blowing from the southwest. Visibility was less than a mile. At 23:15 hours, the radar operator on MGB-64 called out, "Contacts, bearing green 40, range 4,000 yards." Hitchins peered into the darkness. The blips on the screen showed 2 German boats moving slowly, almost inviting attack. It felt wrong. Usually, Schnellboots moved at maximum speed. These were loitering. Hitchins sensed the trap, but he also knew the calculus of war. If he turned away, the Germans would slip past and attack the merchant convoys behind him. He had to spring the trap to break it. "All boats," Hitchins spoke into the radio, his voice calm. "Engage the contacts, but watch your flanks. Keep your eyes open." The British formation surged forward, engines screaming as they hit 36 knots. The distance closed. 3,000 yards. 2,000. The German decoys turned and ran, just as expected, pulling the British deeper into the dark. Then, the ocean exploded. At 23:47, flares burst overhead, turning the night into a blinding white glare. From the darkness to the west, 4 Schnellboots emerged, their bows cutting white wakes. At the same time, radar picked up 2 more closing from the east. 8 German boats against 6 British. "Hard a port!" Hitchins yelled. "Engage the western group! Maximum violence!" The ambush dissolved into a chaotic, close-range brawl. It wasn't a naval battle, it was a knife fight in a phone booth. The range dropped to less than 100 yards. MGB-64 locked onto the leading German boat, S-86. The power turrets swung around. The gunner depressed the triggers, and 4 streams of .303 incendiary rounds hammered the German bridge. The plexiglass shattered. The German helmsman collapsed over the wheel. S-86 veered wildly, colliding with the boat next to it. But the Germans were fighting back with everything they had. Green tracer fire from their 20mm cannons raked the British line. MGB-67 took a hit to the engine room, black smoke pouring from her stern. Suddenly, a new threat emerged from the smoke. S-68, commanded by the aggressive Baron von Mirbach, saw Hitchins' flagship exposed. The German commander turned his boat for a torpedo run. At this range, less than 600 yards, a torpedo miss was impossible. "Torpedo bearing red 90, the lookout screamed. There was no time to turn. Hitchins watched the German boat line up the shot. He was seconds away from death. Then a shadow flashed past him. MGB-74, commanded by Lieutenant David Shaw, one of Hitchins' youngest protégés, saw the danger. Shaw didn't fire. He didn't have the angle. Instead, he shoved his throttles to the firewall and steered his boat directly at the German attacker. It was a game of chicken played with 50 tons of wood and high explosives. Von Mirbach flinched. If he fired the torpedo now, the explosion of the British boat ramming him would destroy them both. He wrenched his wheel hard to starboard to avoid the collision. The torpedo tubes swung away harmlessly. The trap was broken. Hitchins seized the moment. "Press the attack! Don't let them regroup!" The British gunboats swarmed into the gap Shaw had created. They poured fire into the confused German formation. S-86, already damaged, took a round to her fuel tanks. A massive fireball erupted, lighting up the seascape for miles. The boat disintegrated, taking her crew with her. Another German boat, S-17, lost her forward gun and turned to flee, smoke trailing from her bilges. Peterson's master plan had relied on order and precision. Confronted by the sheer ferocity of the British counterattack, the German discipline cracked. The remaining Schnellboots dumped their torpedoes into the sea to gain speed and scattered into the night, racing for the safety of Cherbourg. When the sun rose on August 13th, The balance of power in the English Channel had shifted forever. The British had lost no ships. The Germans had lost 1 boat sunk and 5 heavily damaged. The ambulance count at Cherbourg was grim. 53 German sailors killed or wounded. Peterson wrote a report the next day that ended the era of German dominance. "Engagement with British gunboats is forbidden," he wrote, "unless we possess a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Their volume of fire is overwhelming." Robert Hitchins had done the impossible. He had taken a defeated, demoralized force and turned them into the predators of the Channel. The floating coffins were gone. The gunboats ruled the night. But war is a relentless machine. It consumes its heroes. As 1942 turned into 1943, the pace of operations accelerated. Hitchins was at sea almost every night. His face grew gaunt. His eyes were sunken dark hollows. He refused to rest. He refused to let anyone else lead the dangerous missions. He told his friends that he was living on borrowed time. In April 1943, the intelligence reports identified a massive German convoy moving along the coast of Brittany. It was heavily escorted by minesweepers and flak ships. It was a target too big to ignore. Hitchins was ordered to intercept. The weather was worsening. The sea was rough. Any other commander might have turned back. Hitchins ordered the flotilla to sail. He didn't know it, but he was sailing toward his final battle. And this time, the enemy wouldn't be a Schnellboot he could outgun. It would be a stray shell in the darkness, a roll of the dice that no amount of tactical genius could defeat. April 1943. The English Channel was no longer the graveyard of British hopes. Thanks to the revolution Robert Hitchins had forced upon the Royal Navy, the nights belonged to the motor gunboats. But the architect of that victory was a man running on fumes. Hitchins had been at war without pause for 3 years. His hair was thinning, his face lined with the deep exhaustion of command. He was 36 years old, but in the harsh light of the briefing room, he looked 50. He had become a legend in the coastal forces. Younger officers looked at him with awe. They told stories about his invincibility, about how he could smell a German ambush before it appeared on radar. But Hitchins knew the truth. There is no such thing as invincibility in a wooden boat filled with high-octane fuel and ammunition. There is only probability. And the longer you roll the dice, the closer you get to the number that kills you. On the night of April 12, 1943, the intelligence report landed on his desk. A German convoy was moving along the coast of Brittany. It wasn't just a few merchant ships. It was a priority target, heavily escorted by flak ships, converted trawlers armed with rapid-fire cannons. The weather was deteriorating. A heavy swell was running, the kind of sea state that makes gunnery difficult and navigation a nightmare. A prudent commander might have stayed in port. Hitchins ordered the flotilla to sail. He had built his reputation on the belief that bad weather was an ally, a cloak that hid the hunter. Hitchins led the column in his faithful MGB-64. As they approached the French coast, the darkness was absolute. Then, at 0130 hours, star shells burst overhead, bathing the ocean in a sickly yellow light. The Germans were waiting. The engagement that followed was a confused, violent melee. The British boats were caught in a crossfire between the German shore batteries and the escort ships. Tracers crisscrossed the night like a woven net of fire. Hitchins saw that his flotilla was losing formation in the chaos. He did what he always did. He led from the front to draw the enemy's fire. He steered MGB-64 toward the largest German escort vessel, his gunners pouring fire into its bridge. The German ship returned fire with a heavy autocannon. The air around the bridge of MGB-64 snapped with the supersonic crack of passing rounds. Then, a single stray shell, a random piece of metal fired blindly into the dark, struck the bridge. It didn't explode. It shattered the structure. Robert Hitchins fell. He didn't say a final word. He didn't make a speech. He was simply gone, killed instantly by the random violence of the war he had mastered. The man who had revolutionized naval warfare, who had outsmarted the German Admiralty and defeated their best commanders, was dead. The flotilla withdrew, battered and heartbroken. They brought his body back to England, covering him with the white ensign. He was buried at sea with full naval honors, the waves of the Channel claiming the man who had fought so hard to control them. The news of his death sent a shockwave through the coastal forces. The father of the gunboat was gone. In Berlin, the German Naval Command noted the death with professional relief. They believed that without Hitchins, the British threat would diminish. They were wrong. Robert Hitchins was dead, but his idea was bulletproof. The legacy of the motor gunboat didn't end that night off Brittany. In fact, it was just beginning. In the build-up to June 1944, the MGB flotillas became the guardians of the greatest invasion in history. On D-Day, as thousands of Allied ships crossed the Channel to Normandy, the flanks of the invasion corridor were patrolled by the boats Hitchins had designed. They formed a ring of steel around the invasion fleet. When the Schnellboots tried to attack the landing ships, they were intercepted and chewed up by the descendants of MGB 64. Because of the doctrine Hitchins had fought for, the German Navy failed to sink a single major troop transport on D-Day. The influence of his gunboat theory spread far beyond Britain. Across the Atlantic, the United States Navy was watching. Initially, American PT boats relied heavily on torpedoes. But as the war in the Pacific intensified, American commanders realized what Hitchins had proven in 1941. Torpedoes were useless against barges and small craft. They needed guns. By 1944, U.S. PT boats were being refitted into barge busters, bristling with 37mm cannons and heavy machine guns, a direct tactical evolution of Hitchins' philosophy. Decades later, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and NATO navies embraced the concept of the fast attack craft. These weren't torpedo carriers. They were gun platforms and later missile boats. The modern naval doctrine of using small, fast, heavily armed vessels to deny sea control to larger ships can be traced directly back to the lawyer who argued that a boat without torpedoes wasn't useless. It was deadly. But the most poignant part of Robert Hitchins' story isn't about tactics or ships. It's about the man who tried to stop him. For years, historians portrayed Rear Admiral Lionel Preston, the man who tried to cancel the MGB program in 1942, as the villain of the story. He was the stubborn bureaucrat, the obstacle to progress. But in 2007, researchers digging through declassified Admiralty files found a document that changed the narrative. It was a memorandum written by Admiral Preston, dated April 28, 1943, just 2 weeks after Hitchins was killed. In the memo, Preston addressed the future of the coastal forces. He wrote with a candor that is rare in military records. He admitted that he had opposed the gunboat program because he feared the reckless aggression would lead to the slaughter of young crews. He admitted he favored the safety of tradition. But then, the Admiral wrote this: "Commander Hitchins proved me wrong. His methods, which I believed would result in disaster, instead achieved results that conventional approaches never could. I opposed innovation because I feared its costs. I did not recognize that refusing to innovate had costs of its own. It is my recommendation that his tactical manual be adopted as the standard doctrine for all coastal forces." The man who had been Hitchins' greatest enemy became the guardian of his legacy. Preston didn't just admit he was wrong. He ensured that Hitchins' work would survive. He recommended a posthumous promotion and pushed for the continued expansion of the gunboat fleet. It is a rare thing in history for the establishment to bow so completely to the rebel. It proved that Hitchins hadn't just won the battle at sea, he had won the battle of ideas. Robert Hitchins took a terrifying reality that British sailors were dying in floating coffins and refused to accept it. He looked at a problem that experts said was unsolvable and solved it by breaking every rule in the book. He proved that sometimes the amateur sees what the professional cannot. He proved that one person, armed with the right idea and enough stubbornness to endure the ridicule, can change the course of a war. The motor gunboats are gone now. Most were scrapped or burned after the war. There are no great monuments to MGB 64. But if you look at a modern naval patrol boat bristling with autocannons and sensors, you are looking at the DNA of Robert Hitchins. He died in the dark, in a wooden boat, far from home. But he left a light that showed the way for everyone who came after him. If this story of Robert Hitchins and the gunboats that saved Britain inspired you, please hit that like button. It helps these forgotten stories reach more people. And if you want to see more deep dives into the unsung heroes who changed history with nothing but grit and a good idea, make sure you're subscribed. We have so many more stories to tell. Leave a comment below. Do you think modern militaries still have trouble accepting new ideas? Or have they learned the lesson of the motor gunboat? Thanks for watching.